Michael, we're going to start with the situation in Russia because obviously everybody is discussing what happened over the weekend. In the Western press, there are a lot of statements saying that what happened with Prigozhin, with this semi-revolt, showed the cracks in the Russian political system and the Russian president's grip on power. Are these cracks good or bad news for the West?
Well, I think they're good news. And of course, it's complicated. There's some cracks. There's some things that Putin did right. But on balance, Putin is much weaker today than he was just 4 or 5 days ago. Elites in Russia, soldiers in Russia are all watching this and wondering what's happened to our leader. And I think that's good because a weakened Russia might do less in terms of damage, principally in Ukraine. So I think this is positive news for the United States and positive news for Ukraine.
Michael, in terms of the things that Putin did right, what can you say?
Well, I want to go through the long list that he did wrong, but let me start with the right things. That when push came to shove, he found a way to avoid starting a civil war. He found a way to avoid bloodshed, and maybe he's found a way to get rid of his Wagner problem and his Prigozhin problem that has been festering for a long time. It didn't just happen over this weekend. And in that respect, I think that's better than the alternative. But I think it's important to remember, how did he get to this moment? He got to this moment because of weakness. He got to this moment because he created Wagner in the first place. Strong leaders don't need private armies. They rely on their own armies. Strong leaders don't have to deal with mutinies. That doesn't happen. Strong leaders aren't on the verge of civil war, as Mr. Putin was. And strong leaders don't have to negotiate with traitors. To me, that is the most striking thing about what happened over the last several days. Just hours after Putin called these Prigozhin folks, and Prigozhin himself, without naming names, because Putin never does, he called them traitors, then he negotiated with them. And then he gave them a free get-out-of-jail-free pass to go to Belarus. That is not a move of strength. That's a move of weakness.
Michael, on Monday, John Kirby said that the U.S. is concerned about any possibility of instability in Russia. Are there general fears, understanding that instability in Russia can spill over? What are the threats?
Well, the United States traditionally for decades has always been worried about instability inside the Soviet Union and then Russia, for the main reason is that Russia has nuclear weapons, and we don't want those nuclear weapons to get into the hands of people irresponsible. And that's, I think, centrally what's motivating the Biden administration in their comments. But to me, there's a prescription that comes from that. Where did this instability come from? What sparked it? Putin's invasion of Ukraine. No invasion of Ukraine, no mutiny by Prigozhin soldiers. And therefore, if you're worried about instability, whether you're President Biden or Xi Jinping in China, I think this is the time to put more pressure on Mr. Putin to end his war in Ukraine. Because the longer that war goes on, the more likely we are going to see future events of instability inside Russia.
Michael, I want to quote your recent article from Washington Post, and you advocate for the United States to be more active on the diplomatic front around Ukraine and basically bring diplomacy back to the table. U.S. needs to do more to help Ukraine win peace. You're right. What's the exact premise here?
Well, there's lots of people talking about peace around the world. And who doesn't support peace? We all support peace. I think the central decision maker for peace is Putin. And so if you're floating a peace idea that doesn't include a way to convince Putin to leave Ukraine, it's naive. And so what I would like to see the Biden administration do is a couple of things. One, to name their own envoy for peace negotiations, like Xi Jinping has done, so that our arguments are out there in the public domain. And especially, I would say, in places like Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, where we're not winning the argument about how peace should come about. So they have one. Why shouldn't we have one? Number two, the main central, very difficult task for Ukraine when the war is over is going to be reconstruction and making sure that they survive, just first recover and then thrive as a market economy and as a democracy. And so I think we should appoint a special coordinator to make sure that we help that reconstruction process as comprehensive as possible. Three, there are tens of thousands of Russians, as you know, that are scattered all over the world today. They're facing all kinds of difficulties. They can't access their bank accounts. They can't get work permits. They most certainly can't get visas to come to the United States. I think this is a catastrophic failure on part of the West in general and the United States. We need to be encouraging these people to come to our countries, to work in our countries, and I mean both the tech entrepreneurs that we would want to see here where I live, but also those that are in the media business, those that are in the civil society business. We want to give them the means to continue to do their work abroad. And so I think we should have a de facto ambassador or diplomatic coordinator to interact with these people to help them solve the basic problems that they're facing. And then finally, President Biden has announced that he plans to appoint Jim O'Brien as the new Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia. By the way, I know Mr. O'Brien. I think that is a fantastic hire. He's a perfect person to take that job. But right now, he's the coordinator of sanctions, and they therefore, I believe, need to appoint a new coordinator with the same stature that Jim brought to that job, so that we continue to not only put in place better and more effective sanctions right now, but that person should continue to do that job to put pressure on Russia after the war is over, so that they pay their fair share of reconstruction inside Ukraine. That is reparations for Ukraine. We need somebody, high-level person, to keep pushing that agenda after the war is over.
Michael, speaking about Russian people abroad and immigration currently, you actually said in an article that immigration should be encouraged. At the same time, we know that the treatment that Russian people live in Russia in the West is not exactly very warm. We're observing the Baltic countries putting a lot of restrictions. We also heard from the Czech president that every Russian person who arrives to the West should be under very close scrutiny of the Western intelligence services. Do you think it's going to be difficult to change that mindset?
Yes, and rightfully so. I think we should be suspicious of Russians immigrating. We don't know who they are and what their motivations are. And most certainly among that wave, there are Russian intelligence officers that we do not have an interest working in our countries. That said, I want more attention to these problems rather than just keeping everybody in. For instance, I believe you should charge an extra fee. I call it a Ukrainian reconstruction fee for people to receive visas to travel to the democratic world. And even, that's as a signal that you don't support Putin's war back home. And most certainly, if you're seeking to work in the West and stay in the West, you have to denounce Putin's war and stop paying taxes in Russia, because paying taxes in Russia today is funding Putin's brutal, barbaric war inside Ukraine. So rather than doing nothing, I think there are creative solutions that could give Russian incentives to leave, because I want Russians to leave. I want to be clear about that. Every Russian, especially young men who leave Russia today, is a future Russian soldier that won't be sent to the battlefield in Ukraine. And if this war is going to drag on for some time, we've got to be much smarter about how we reduce Putin's capacity to fight in Ukraine. And one of the ways of doing that is to drain the best and brightest from Russia so that they're not contributing to the Russian economy, but also to drain the population that could be drafted to fight in Putin's war.
Michael, if we turn to the curious role of Alexander Lukashenko in averting this crisis in Russia, it's widely discussed now. He made a number of statements himself. He said that the armed forces of Belarus can actually benefit from shifting Wagner troops to Belarus. He also said that Wagner troops would not be allowed to look after the nuclear arsenal that Russia is seemingly transferring to Belarus based on the previous agreement. Based on all this, if Putin emerged cracked from the crisis, how did Lukashenko fare in that regard?
Short term, very positive. Medium term, maybe not so positive. So yes, he was revered as a hero by Russian propagandists when the deal was done, but they've already turned on him. If you watch Russian television and you see what they're saying, they're already saying he didn't play the role that he did. Second, he should be very careful in trying to incorporate Wagner forces into Belarusian forces because they have no loyalty to him. They're hired guns. They're mercenaries. They have zero loyalty to him, zero loyalty to Putin too, by the way. And the scenario that you just saw, that Putin just faced, could easily become a problem for Mr. Lukashenko. And let's be clear, he has much less control over his society than Putin does. And he has a much weaker fighting force than Mr. Putin does. So he may come to regret bringing these fighter forces there, and especially Prigozhin himself. Prigozhin right now is a popular figure inside Russia. And if he chooses to nurture that popularity in exile in Belarus, Lukashenko is going to have a problem with the Kremlin as well.
Michael, when we heard from the American, from the White House, basically, and when we heard when the American press wrote about how American intelligence actually knew in advance about Prigozhin's plans, wouldn't be Prigozhin a nightmare scenario for Washington if he toppled Putin? And why was there were no more effort done to actually maybe share this information to prevent what happened? Because at the very beginning it said that there was belief that there might be success in what he was planning.
You know, this conversation reminds me of a meeting that I was in with President Obama, President Medvedev, and Foreign Minister Lavrov back in 2009 at the UN General Assembly meeting, when we told the world about secret information that we had about Iran's nuclear facilities. And Lavrov came up to me and said, "Why didn't you tell us, Michael?" And I said, "Because of course we thought you knew. Iran, after all, is your client state, not ours." And that's my same reaction here. If US intelligence knew about these plots, I find it impossible to believe that the FSB, Russian intelligence services, did not know about it as well. They have much greater resources following Mr. Prigozhin and all these people than we do. So I don't believe that they didn't know it. I'm struck by the opposite, that they knew it, they must have known it, and they didn't do anything about it. That suggests to me that Putin was confused about what he was doing. With respect to your second question about Prigozhin taking over Russia, and that would be dangerous for the United States, I would say two things. One, to the best of my knowledge, and I obviously don't have access to secret information, Prigozhin had no intention of overthrowing Putin. That's what he said many, many times. His goal was to get Putin's attention so that he would remove what he thought were corrupt leaders of the Russian military. Now, I think it was a pretty crazy plan to get Putin's attention to do that. Mr. Prigozhin was under a lot of stress. I think he thought he was going to be liquidated and his forces were going to be dismantled, but that was never a scenario. Having said all that, I believe that Putin, for many, many years, has made this argument. And even when I was in the government almost a decade ago, they were always saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Better to support me because you don't know about these really bad guys that might come after me. I have a somewhat different view. I think Mr. Putin is a really bad guy. I think he's doing a lot of horrific damage in Ukraine. I find it hard to imagine that another leader would be even more threatening. And to the idea that they would take over and be more threatening, I don't think that would be the scenario. Even if a guy like Mr. Prigozhin in some scenario that I think is extremely unlikely, but let's say that he did take over or somebody like him, they wouldn't hold on to power. They don't have any popular support. No governors would support him. The intelligence services wouldn't support him. The oligarchs wouldn't support him. In fact, I think an attempted coup attempt like that would accelerate the further weakness of the Russian government. And remember, in 1991, we saw a play of that. There was a coup attempt. They took over, and it lasted 3 days. And it led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So to all these horror stories, you know, it's going to be somebody more fascistic and more scary. I don't believe it. I actually think it would weaken the Russian regime right now, the Russian regime that is doing horrific things in Ukraine right now. And anything that weakens that Russian horrific regime, I think is good for peace and stability in the long run.
Michael, do you think that the Russian military will be disabled in Ukraine now without Wagner, from what we know?
It's a great question, Yulia, and I don't know the answer to that question. I would say two things. One, taking the Wagner forces off the battlefield, that is good for Ukraine. These are horrible killers. They're thugs, they're mercenaries, but they're well-trained killers. And they were achieving results in Bakhmut that the conventional forces of Russia were not. And so if they are out of the war, that's good for Ukraine. That is bad for Russia. Number two, what I'm really interested in, and I don't know yet, but I am really interested in what soldiers, privates, not generals, are thinking who are currently occupying Ukraine. If I were one of those soldiers watching this fiasco, this mutiny, and then Putin response and Putin pleading with traitors to join his forces. Remember, that's what he's done. He went on national television and he pleaded with these guys, these thugs, these mercenaries, these traitors, these people that killed Russian soldiers. I think that's really important for people to understand. It wasn't Navalny that killed Russian soldiers. It wasn't Ukrainians that killed Russian soldiers inside Russia. It was Prigozhin and his Wagner mercenaries that killed them. And yet Putin said, come on, guys, join my side. Bygones. There'll be no repercussions. You're not going to go to jail. We're going to either let you retire in Belarus or we're going to give you new contracts to join our military. Man, if I was a soldier fighting that signed up to defend the fatherland, that signed up because I believe that my commanders and my chief commander Putin was right in saying that we're fighting Nazis in Ukraine, and suddenly there's all this mixed messaging, including from Prigozhin himself, who made a plea to these soldiers to say your commanders have been lying to you. I think that must be dealing a real blow to the morale of these soldiers. Now, I don't know that. I'm just guessing, but I would be very worried about that if I were Vladimir Putin.
Michael, very last question. There is a popular line saying that when and if Putin feels very cornered, then there is a real risk of using nuclear weapons. Now, there are nukes in Belarus, allegedly, according to Lukashenko. There is Wagner and Prigozhin in Belarus. What's going to happen with all that? And do you think that the nuclear threat to the West, to the neighbors, has increased?
Well, obviously, I don't have access to secret intelligence, so I don't know what my government's thinking. And most certainly, because nuclear weapons are at play, even if the assessment is that it might be only a 1% probability that he would use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, President Biden and his team have to take that very seriously. You want that to be 0.9, 0.8, 0.6, 0.5, 0.2%, not 1%, right? So it's a very serious issue. And I know the Biden administration is taking it very seriously. But let me tell you what I've observed about this threat of escalation. We've been hearing about this for months and months and months. If we do this, he'll escalate. If we do that, he'll escalate. We send him planes, he'll escalate. We send him patriots, he'll escalate. We invite Ukraine to join NATO, he'll escalate. But what happened over the weekend? Putin was pushed into a corner. He faced a real threat to himself. And did he escalate? No, he capitulated. He negotiated. He didn't bomb those soldiers on the road to Moscow. He didn't crush them with overwhelming force. That would have been the escalatory move. Instead, he negotiated. And I think that's an important lesson for everybody to understand. It doesn't mean he'll do it again, but there are many times, by the way, when he was in a standoff with Erdogan, and Erdogan called his bluff and shot down one of his planes, and everybody said, "Oh my goodness, Mr. Putin, he's going to escalate. We're going to see war." No, he stood down. He negotiated. So again, I don't want to presume I'll know what he'll do in another situation, but there's reason to challenge that just knee-jerk assumption that the only thing he's going to do is escalate. Sometimes leaders, when they're faced with a bad and really bad choice, they choose the bad choice. That's what Putin did with respect to this mutiny. And by the way, I support that. I'm glad that he did not double down and try to take on the Wagner forces and spark a civil war among Russians. That was a good choice compared to the alternatives. But I think we should learn that lesson, that maybe he might do the same if he begins to lose in Ukraine as well.